The neighborhood had always appeared picture-perfect. A suburban tableau of neat lawns, freshly painted fences, and identical mailboxes that lined streets like clockwork. On this particular morning, the sun reflected off trimmed hedges. The sidewalks glistened from an early mist, and the quiet hum of sprinklers provided a gentle background score to a world that seemed perfectly ordered. To most, it was a haven. But for one new resident, it was about to become the stage for an unexpected battle. When Alex moved in, it was meant to be a fresh start. After years of city life filled with constant noise and chaos, the suburbs promised calm, predictability, and a sense of belonging. The small brick house on Elmwood Lane, with its welcoming porch and fenced backyard, seemed ideal. Yet, Alex wasn't just moving into a new house, he was moving in with Riley, a golden retriever trained to be a service dog. Riley was more than a companion, he was a lifeline, a trained partner capable of sensing anxiety attacks, providing stability, and offering support that words could never express. The first days in the neighborhood passed peacefully. Alex and Riley settled in, mowing the lawn together, tending to the small garden, and waving politely at neighbors on morning walks. Most residents nodded in quiet acknowledgement, exchanging standard pleasantries. Yet one resident, Karen, the self-appointed guardian of neighborhood decorum, seemed immediately unsettled by their presence. Karen, known in the community for her relentless adherence to rules and a sharp, unyielding personality, noticed Riley the moment they entered the cul-de-sac. She was often seen patrolling the streets in her minivan, clipboard in hand, measuring fences, noting the slightest deviation in mailbox height, and documenting anything she deemed out of line with her interpretation of perfection. It began subtly at first. A folded note appeared tucked under the front door mat, carefully addressed to Alex. It cited neighborhood regulations, politely requesting that Riley be kept out of certain areas of the property, especially the front lawn. Alex initially assumed it was a misunderstanding, something easily clarified. He reviewed the HOA bylaws thoroughly and noted no restriction against service animals. The law clearly protected Riley. Yet, Karen's note carried a tone that suggested she had already made up her mind. She had observed, she had judged, and she was ready to act. As days passed, Karen's scrutiny became more noticeable. She would linger on walks, her gaze sharp, tracking every movement of Riley. The dog, trained to remain calm under stress, maintained his composure, sitting patiently as Karen muttered to herself, measuring the angle of the porch steps, or noting the spacing of the flower beds. Meanwhile, Alex began documenting each interaction, taking photographs and writing detailed logs of Karen's actions. The notes seemed petty at first: misplaced garden gnome, a hedge cut slightly too short, but it quickly became clear that Karen had fixated not just on aesthetics, but on the very presence of Riley. The tension escalated when Karen began leaving messages directly on the windshield of Alex's car, parked neatly in the driveway. These messages ranged from polite suggestions to increasingly aggressive statements, warning that Riley's presence might violate unspecified neighborhood rules. Though Alex knew that service animals were legally protected under federal law, the repeated targeting began to create an atmosphere of intimidation. It was subtle psychological warfare, an attempt to unsettle, to make daily life uncomfortable, and to coerce compliance. Soon, other neighbors started noticing the interactions. Some offered sympathetic glances, careful not to get involved. Others whispered quietly amongst themselves, uncertain whether Alex had breached some unspoken protocol, or if Karen had taken the neighborhood policing to an extreme. Meanwhile, Karen seemed emboldened. She began attending HOA meetings with a deliberate purpose, raising questions about animals in front yards, and the supposed impact on property values. Her voice, measured and authoritative, masked the personal vendetta she had begun against Alex and Riley. Alex, however, was not intimidated. Every note, every lingering stare, every message on the windshield only strengthened his resolve. He knew the law was on his side, and he also understood the importance of creating a clear record. Each photograph of Karen's stalking, each log of the notes, and every documented encounter was compiled meticulously. It was a slow burn, a calculated accumulation of evidence that would eventually support his case. Yet, for all his preparation, the mental and emotional strain was real. Every step outside with Riley became a calculated decision. Alex watched Karen from a distance, noting her routines, understanding her patterns, and preparing for the inevitable escalation. The once peaceful streets now carried an undercurrent of tension, a quiet unease that came from knowing that someone had made it their mission to undermine daily life. By the end of the first month, it was evident that this was not a minor neighborhood dispute. Karen had drawn a line, and Alex had no intention of crossing it. Riley, ever calm and supportive, remained by his side, a silent guardian against intimidation. And as the sun set over Elmwood Lane, casting long shadows across the manicured lawns, it was clear that a quiet war was about to begin. One that would test not just patience, but the limits of law, community, and the unyielding spirit of a man defending the companion who was his lifeline. The tension in the air was palpable. Karen's obsession with Riley had only just begun, and Alex's determination to protect his rights was only growing stronger. The stage was set, the players identified, and the opening moves had been made. This was more than a neighborhood squabble. It was a confrontation between law, personal freedom, and an overzealous HOA member who had underestimated the resolve of a man with everything to lose. As the chapter closed, Alex knew one thing for certain. The arrival of trouble was no accident. But neither was his preparation for what was coming next. Karen's fixation had crossed a line, and the law, alongside meticulous documentation, was about to become an unexpected ally. The early signs of tension had been subtle, almost easily dismissed, but by the second month, it became clear that Karen's obsession with Riley had escalated far beyond casual scrutiny. Where once there had been a folded note or a passing glare, now there were daily intrusions, deliberate and calculated, designed to unnerve. She appeared on the sidewalk at precise intervals, her eyes following Alex and Riley with unsettling precision, taking notes in a small notebook she carried everywhere. Every trip to the mailbox, every morning walk, and every evening return home was observed, recorded, and later referenced in increasingly aggressive communications. It began with small confrontations at the property line. Karen would lean over fences, peering directly at Riley, making gestures that seemed meant to provoke. Her tone, once cautiously polite, in notes and letters, had shifted to thinly veiled threats, often hinting at unspecified rules she claimed were being broken. Each message or intrusion was designed to erode confidence, to communicate that Alex was being watched, measured, and judged. For most residents, it was a petty annoyance. For Alex, it was a challenge to his sense of security and the law itself. The escalation was methodical. Karen's letters became increasingly verbose, citing obscure rules with vague language, often suggesting that Riley's presence somehow violated community standards or property values. She referenced bylaws that were intentionally ambiguous, twisting clauses to her own benefit. Alex meticulously documented each interaction, capturing photographs of notes left in his mailbox, messages on his windshield, and even video footage of Karen pacing near the yard while taking notes. Every action was a piece of evidence, a potential shield against the harassment that was intensifying day by day. Meanwhile, the psychological pressure began to affect the neighborhood's atmosphere. Other residents, initially neutral, whispered amongst themselves about the ongoing conflict. Some offered quiet support, discreetly nodding to Alex during walks or expressing sympathy in private conversations. Others remained silent, fearful of drawing Karen's ire or becoming entangled in the dispute. Karen, however, remained undeterred, her public posture always one of moral authority and civic duty. She maintained the appearance of righteousness, even as her actions grew more invasive and personal. The tipping point came when Karen escalated her campaign beyond letters and stares. One morning, Alex found a sharply worded notice pinned to his front door, this time threatening potential fines or penalties for perceived violations of neighborhood regulations regarding animals. The language was vague yet menacing, a calculated attempt to intimidate without referencing any specific legal grounds. It was an unmistakable signal. Karen had moved from passive observation to aggressive harassment. In response, Alex doubled his efforts to document every encounter. Every note, every email, and every instance of Karen's presence near the property became part of a growing record. He cataloged times, dates, locations, and descriptions, ensuring that nothing could be dismissed as hearsay or coincidence. Each photograph captured Riley calmly sitting, as Karen prowled. Each video clip revealed her lingering presence at unusual hours. This growing body of evidence would later serve as the foundation for legal action, but in the moment, it represented the mounting tension that defined daily life. The escalation was not limited to written or visual harassment. Karen began attending HOA meetings with a laser focus on Alex's household. She would raise concerns publicly, painting Riley as a disruption, questioning whether the dog's presence violated unspecified community norms. Her performance was meticulous, projecting authority, concern, and a sense of moral urgency that few questioned. The board, largely deferential to her dominance, rarely challenged her assertions, allowing her to reinforce the narrative of Alex as a problem resident. Despite the mounting pressure, Alex remained resolute. He understood the law, the protections afforded to service animals, and the obligations of homeowners associations to enforce rules fairly and without discrimination. The repeated targeting of his household was not a coincidence, it was selective enforcement, precisely what the law prohibited. And as Karen continued to intensify her campaign, Alex realized that this confrontation would not be resolved by patience alone. A strategic approach was necessary, combining legal knowledge, thorough documentation, and public accountability. The next stage of escalation occurred in the form of public confrontation. Karen began to appear at local parks and sidewalks during Alex and Riley's routine walks. She would observe from a distance, often taking photographs or recording video, her behavior bordering on surveillance. Other residents began to notice, some whispering about the unusual intensity of her actions, others sharing quiet support for Alex, recognizing the unfairness of the situation. Yet Karen's relentless persistence continued, undeterred by social norms or passive opposition. Each day brought new challenges. The accumulation of letters, photographs, and unwarranted observations created an environment of constant tension. Riley, trained to provide stability in moments of anxiety, remained calm, acting as a silent anchor against the stress imposed by Karen's relentless scrutiny. Alex relied on this steadiness, finding moments of clarity in the dog's unwavering presence, using that strength to maintain focus on legal remedies and strategic planning. By the end of the second month, it was evident that the conflict had shifted from a simple neighborhood dispute to a calculated campaign of harassment. Karen's actions were no longer subtle, they were aggressive, targeted, and consistent. Yet, for every note, every observation, and every effort to intimidate, Alex responded with meticulous documentation and strategic foresight. The tension had reached a point where inaction was no longer an option. Legal recourse, public accountability, and thorough preparation were essential. The chapter closed with a sense of impending confrontation. Karen's harassment had intensified, Riley remained an unwavering partner, and Alex's resolve had solidified. The neighborhood, once a quiet backdrop, had transformed into a battleground where the stakes were high. The rules were being challenged, and the law loomed as a powerful ally waiting to be invoked. The stage was set for the coming conflict, a test of endurance, strategy, and the principle that no one, no matter how authoritative, could override the protections guaranteed by law. The constant barrage of harassment had transformed Alex's daily life into a careful exercise of vigilance and preparation. Every move outside his home required awareness of Karen's potential presence, yet he refused to alter his routines in fear. Instead, he embraced a strategic mindset, turning every incident into actionable evidence, every observation into a record that could later support his legal claims. This was no longer just about tolerating neighborly complaints. It was a calculated response to targeted intimidation. Alex began by creating a comprehensive log of all interactions. Each letter from Karen was cataloged, scanned, and digitally archived with time. Photographs of Riley during walks, showing the dog's calm and unobtrusive behavior, were compiled meticulously. Video recordings of Karen lurking near the property or following their routine became central pieces of evidence. Every instance, no matter how minor it seemed in isolation, contributed to a growing dossier that would eventually demonstrate a consistent pattern of harassment. Parallel to documenting, Alex researched the full scope of his rights as a service dog owner. He delved into federal and state laws protecting service animals, reviewing legal precedents and interpretations that underscored the obligations of private property owners, homeowners associations, and community boards. He highlighted the sections most relevant to his situation, focusing on prohibitions against discrimination, the right of reasonable accommodation, and the limitations on selective enforcement of community rules. Legal statutes that might appear abstract suddenly took on urgent, practical significance. With knowledge as his foundation, Alex began strategizing. The first goal was to make the harassment undeniable. Evidence alone would not be enough if it lacked clarity and context, so he focused on documenting not just the acts, but the intent behind them. Notes and photos were paired with context. Time of day, proximity to the property, Riley's behavior, and Karen's apparent motivations. By connecting the dots, he could demonstrate that these were not isolated incidents, but a deliberate campaign aimed specifically at him. Public accountability became another cornerstone of Alex's strategy. He quietly shared portions of the documentation with sympathetic neighbors, seeking validation and witnesses who could confirm Karen's behavior. Others, who had long endured petty fines or intrusive demands from the H, began sharing their own experiences, inadvertently corroborating the selective enforcement pattern. The community, once silent, began to stir. Whispered support turned into conversations at sidewalks, and slowly, the notion that Karen's actions were unreasonable began to gain traction. Simultaneously, Alex initiated discreet consultations with legal professionals experienced in HOA disputes and service dog accommodations. Lawyers reviewed his evidence, advised on proper documentation techniques, and outlined potential courses of action. Alex learned that selective enforcement, penalizing one resident while ignoring identical situations among others, was a particularly strong legal lever. Vague community rules, when applied inconsistently, were often struck down in court, especially when harassment could be proven. This realization solidified his resolve. Karen's obsessive campaign could become her legal undoing. The strategy extended beyond passive documentation. Alex also implemented proactive measures to prevent further claims of rule violations. Riley's Harness and Vest clearly identified him as a service dog, ensuring that any attempt to question his presence would be visibly unfounded. Routes for walks were chosen to avoid accidental disputes with neighbors while maintaining normalcy. Cameras were positioned at strategic angles to capture Karen's presence without infringing on privacy laws. Every precaution was layered to protect against potential counterclaims, while simultaneously strengthening the narrative of harassment. Meanwhile, Karen intensified her efforts, seemingly sensing that her influence was being challenged. She sent longer letters, full of ominous language and references to unspecified HOA powers, attempting to imply that Alex's actions were legally suspect. Yet each attempt only added more material for Alex's documentation. Every letter became another piece of evidence, demonstrating a pattern of intimidation. Her escalation, paradoxically, fortified Alex's strategy, as it made her actions increasingly difficult to defend in any formal context. Community dynamics began shifting, subtly. Neighbors who had previously avoided involvement started engaging with Alex, sharing their own grievances and expressing admiration for his careful, principled approach. The sense of isolation that had initially defined the conflict gave way to cautious solidarity. Alex realized that the issue was no longer just about Riley or himself. It had become emblematic of broader frustrations with HOA authority and neighborhood overreach. His careful documentation and calm persistence inspired others, setting the stage for collective awareness and potential intervention. The final element of Alex's strategy was timing. He understood that confrontation needed to be deliberate, calculated, and backed by the law. Patience was critical. Each piece of evidence had to be airtight, every sequence of events documented, and every neighbor witness identified. Hastily pursued legal action or public complaints could be dismissed without consideration. Alex's approach emphasized methodical buildup. The more precise and irrefutable the record, the greater the likelihood of a decisive outcome. By the end of this phase, Alex had transformed from a resident under siege into a strategist preparing for decisive action. His days were still punctuated by Karen's intrusive presence, but they were also filled with purpose. The documentation, legal consultations, and community engagement had turned what had been harassment into a clear, undeniable case. Riley remained by his side, a steady presence and the symbol of the legal protections they were about to invoke. As Chapter 3 closed, the battle lines were clearly drawn. Karen's persistent harassment had reached a point where law, strategy, and community support could converge. Alex had fortified his position, prepared his evidence, and quietly rallied allies, setting the stage for a confrontation that would test the limits of HOA authority and individual rights. The next phase promised to be both public and consequential, as patients gave way to formal action and the law prepared to intervene. The weeks of meticulous preparation had set the stage for the next phase of Alex's battle. What had once been a private, tense conflict with Karen had evolved into a confrontation that would test the boundaries of law, authority, and community norms. Every documented incident, every photograph, every neighbor testimony now converged into a single, undeniable narrative. Karen's harassment was intentional, targeted, and legally indefensible. The time for strategic patience had ended. Action was necessary. Alex filed the formal complaint with the local housing authority, citing violations of federal and state service dog laws, selective enforcement of HOA rules, and harassment. The filing was thorough, carefully referencing specific laws that protected service animals and detailing Karen's repeated attempts to intimidate and obstruct his daily life. Legal counsel ensured that every word was precise, leaving no room for ambiguity. The complaint immediately shifted the conflict from neighborhood whispers to an official legal arena, where authority was no longer in Karen's hands, but in the structured and impartial framework of the law. The response from the HOA was swift but uncoordinated. Karen and her allies attempted to frame the complaint as frivolous, citing vague references to community aesthetics and nuisance behavior. Yet Alex's documentation was precise, organized, and unassailable. Every claim she made was countered with evidence. Photographs showing Riley behaving calmly, neighbor accounts of other dogs and vehicles in the same neighborhood, and copies of Karen's letters that revealed a pattern of harassment. What she had hoped would intimidate now worked against her, highlighting her obsession and inconsistent application of the rules. Local media soon caught wind of the case. Journalists were drawn not only to the story of a service dog being challenged by a controlling neighbor, but also to the broader themes of HOA overreach, selective enforcement, and civil rights. Cameras appeared in the neighborhood, capturing Alex walking with Riley, the dog's vest visible and the calm dignity of their daily routine clear to all who watched. Reporters interviewed neighbors, who cautiously shared their frustrations with HOA regulations and subtly reinforced the narrative of Karen's obsession. Public interest added pressure to the HOA, amplifying scrutiny and making every action a matter of record. As the legal proceedings progressed, hearings were scheduled to assess the validity of Alex's claims. Karen appeared at the first session, armed with letters, rule books, and a confidence she hoped would sway the proceedings. She presented herself as a guardian of neighborhood standards, a defender of property values, and a model citizen enforcing community guidelines. Yet under cross-examination, her narrative began to unravel. Specific questions about the definition of oversized or nuisance revealed gaps and inconsistencies. Photographs of other similarly sized dogs, vehicles, and residents' properties contradicted her selective enforcement claims. The law demanded consistency, and every discrepancy became a critical point in Alex's favor. Alex's lawyer presented the counterargument with precision. The law clearly recognized service animals as protected entities, entitled to reasonable accommodations, regardless of neighborhood rules. Selective enforcement of HOA regulations was a violation of these principles, and repeated harassment compounded the offense. Each documented letter, photograph, and neighbor testimony was introduced in sequence, painting a vivid picture of a targeted campaign that was neither random nor justified. Karen's insistence on her authority became increasingly untenable in the face of meticulous legal presentation. The courtroom atmosphere was tense. Karen, once commanding in her neighborhood, now faced scrutiny from judges and officials unconnected to the personal dynamics that had fueled her obsession. Alex maintained composure, calmly explaining the daily reality of living with Riley, the importance of the service dog, and the emotional toll of Karen's relentless harassment. He did not exaggerate or dramatize. He relied on evidence and the law. The contrast was stark. One side relied on meticulous documentation and legal principle, the other on subjective opinions and inconsistent enforcement. Public attention continued to grow. Social media posts, online forums, and local news segments shared details of the proceedings. Many viewers sympathized with Alex, seeing a narrative of a hard-working, law-abiding resident facing petty tyranny from a neighbor obsessed with control. Karen, conversely, began to face public criticism, her insistence on authority appearing increasingly vindictive rather than principled. The combination of legal pressure and public scrutiny created a dynamic where her credibility began to erode. Behind the scenes, Alex continued careful preparation. Every court session, every legal argument, and every new letter from Karen or the HOA was immediately documented. Lawyers refined their strategy, emphasizing legal precedents and reinforcing the moral weight of Alex's position. By turning harassment into verifiable evidence, Alex transformed an emotionally draining conflict into a structured, legally defensible case. Every day reinforced the inevitability of accountability. The law, unlike Karen, could not be swayed by personal bias or obsession. As the hearings progressed, tension in the neighborhood grew. Neighbors who had once avoided confrontation now observed proceedings with anticipation, curious to see whether one individual's determination could challenge entrenched authority. Alex's calm diligence inspired admiration and caution alike. Karen's presence, once intimidating, became increasingly isolating. Fewer neighbors offered her support, and some quietly expressed concern about her judgment. The imbalance of public perception added pressure, reinforcing the legal strategy with social validation. By the end of Chapter 4, the narrative had shifted decisively. Alex's meticulous documentation, legal expertise, and public visibility had turned the tide. Karen's authority was no longer absolute. Every action she had taken was scrutinized and recorded, forming a cohesive case of harassment and selective enforcement. The legal system had begun to favor Alex, aligning with the principles of fairness, consistency, and protection of individual rights. The courtroom had become the ultimate stage where evidence, law, and community awareness converged. The next chapter promised resolution. Karen's obsession would face the full consequences of the law, and Alex's perseverance, diligence, and adherence to legal principles would set the stage for a decisive victory. The battle, once personal and isolating, had become a public and structured confrontation, ready to culminate in accountability and justice. The day of the verdict arrived with an almost palpable tension. Weeks of hearings, meticulous evidence, and mounting public attention had culminated in this single moment. Alex and Rylan entered the courtroom, the service dog calm and alert at his side, a visible symbol of the resilience and routine that had been targeted for so long. Every document, photograph, and witness testimony now hung in the balance. The judge's decision poised to transform months of conflict into clarity and accountability. The courtroom was filled with observers. Neighbors, once silent or hesitant, had come to witness the resolution. Journalists lined the back, cameras aimed, capturing not only the legal process, but the emotional weight of the confrontation. Karen entered with her usual posture of authority, clipboard in hand, attempting to radiate confidence. Yet the energy in the room had shifted. Authority no longer rested with her. The law and public scrutiny now held the ultimate sway. The judge began by reviewing the key points. The laws protecting service animals were explicit, leaving no ambiguity about Riley's rights. Selective enforcement by the HOA, coupled with repeated harassment, clearly violated these statutes. The judge referenced the thorough documentation Alex and his legal team had provided: photographs, neighbor statements, and recorded incidents, all meticulously illustrating Karen's campaign of intimidation. Every instance that had once seemed petty now formed a coherent pattern of legal misconduct. Karen attempted to interject, citing subjective concerns about property values and neighborhood aesthetics. Her arguments faltered under scrutiny, as the judge pointed out inconsistencies and selective enforcement. Multiple properties had similar pets, vehicles, or structures, yet only Alex and Riley were targeted. The law demanded uniformity, and Karen's selective enforcement could not stand. Her insistence on personal authority, once intimidating, now appeared arbitrary and legally untenable. The verdict was delivered with clarity and weight. The judge ruled entirely in Alex's favor. The HOA was barred from imposing any restrictions or fines related to Riley. Karen's actions were officially recognized as harassment and selective enforcement, violating both state and federal protections. The ruling also mandated that the HOA cover Alex's legal expenses, a significant financial consequence reflecting the seriousness of their overreach. The courtroom seemed to exhale collectively, the finality of justice palpable in the air. Alex felt a mixture of relief and quiet triumph. He had not sought public recognition or confrontation. He had sought justice, fairness, and the ability to live without harassment. Now, that goal was realized. Riley remained calm at his side, unaware of the legal intricacies, but attuned to the emotional energy surrounding the victory. Together, they symbolized perseverance, lawfulness, and the principle that no individual should be bullied into submission. Karen's reaction was stark. Her posture faltered, her composure cracking as the legal authority she had wielded with near absolute control was formally challenged. For the first time, her attempts at intimidation and manipulation had failed. She faced both legal consequences and public scrutiny, her credibility in the neighborhood deeply damaged. The court's decision reverberated beyond the walls of the courthouse, signaling a shift in the balance of power. Authority was no longer absolute. Actions had consequences, and overreach would not be tolerated. The aftermath extended beyond the courtroom. News outlets highlighted the case, emphasizing the importance of service dog rights, fair enforcement of HOA rules, and accountability for harassment. Social media buzzed with commentary, support, and admiration for Alex's persistence. The story resonated with many who had faced similar struggles, creating a broader dialogue about neighborhood governance, personal rights, and legal protections. Alex's experience became a reference point, illustrating that thorough documentation, patience, and adherence to the law could overcome even the most entrenched personal conflicts. Within the neighborhood, the ruling reshaped dynamics. Residents who had once quietly endured or feared Karen as authority began to question and challenge arbitrary enforcement. Some approached Alex with gratitude, sharing their own stories and concerns. Others reconsidered their passive acceptance of HOA dictates, emboldened by the legal precedent. The victory extended beyond Alex and Riley. It inspired a subtle cultural shift, fostering accountability, fairness, and community awareness. Karen's personal and social standing suffered. Neighbors who had once deferred to her judgment now treated her with skepticism, some openly expressing disapproval of her conduct. Her role within the HOA became contentious, her credibility undermined by the legal ruling. The ruling served as both punishment and cautionary example, demonstrating that personal vendettas, selective enforcement, and harassment carried tangible consequences, especially when challenged with careful preparation and legal knowledge. Alex, however, remained focused on normalcy. His daily routines resumed, the calm rhythm of life with Riley returning to its rightful place. Walks, errands, and social interactions now carried a sense of ease previously absent. He did not revel in humiliation directed at Karen, nor did he use the victory for personal aggression. The triumph was measured, grounded in principle. Justice had been served, rights had been protected, and fairness had prevailed. By the close of Chapter 5, the narrative had reached its legal and emotional climax. Alex's diligence, resilience, and strategic documentation had not only protected his rights, but had created a ripple effect of awareness, inspiring neighbors and observers alike. Karen's authority had been decisively challenged, her actions held accountable, and the precedent set for equitable enforcement and service animal protections solidified. The story, while resolved legally, hinted at further social consequences and long-term community transformation. The weeks following the courtroom victory were marked by quiet restoration and subtle yet profound shifts within the neighborhood. Alex returned to his routines with Riley by his side, the service dog moving with unassuming confidence. Unaware of the public attention that had surrounded them, what had once been a source of tension and harassment had now become a symbol of resilience and fairness. And with the HOA's authority curtailed, daily life began to regain its rhythm. Neighbors slowly emerged from the shadow of fear that Karen's overbearing enforcement had cast. Conversations that had once been whispered behind closed doors now took place openly on lawns, in driveways, and along sidewalks. Stories of petty fines, arbitrary notices, and selective enforcement were shared, debated, and contextualized. Many residents expressed quiet admiration for Alex, recognizing the courage required to challenge authority without resorting to anger or confrontation. The narrative shifted. What had started as a personal struggle became a catalyst for broader community reflection. Karen's presence in the neighborhood diminished significantly. Once a constant figure, clipboard in hand, she now walked the streets with a careful, guarded posture. Her attempts at intimidation replaced by the wary glances of neighbors who had observed her actions closely over the months. Social standing, carefully cultivated over years of self-assigned authority, invitations to community events dwindled, and the once loyal supporters of her strict enforcement began to distance themselves. The combination of legal accountability and social consequences had rendered her influence nearly obsolete. The HOA itself underwent a period of introspection and structural change. Board members who had aligned with Karen faced criticism and pressure from the community, prompting resignations and a re-evaluation of policies. New leadership emerged, elected by residents eager to foster transparency, fairness, and practical governance. The new board emphasized education over punishment, collaboration over control, and the understanding that enforcement must be applied equitably and within the bounds of the law. Rules that had once been vague and subjectively applied were reviewed, clarified, and codified to prevent future overreach. Alex observed these changes with quiet satisfaction. His goal had never been retribution, but fairness and justice. The neighborhood's transformation validated the effort, research, and patience he had invested. Walks with Riley became a reaffirmation of freedom, the freedom to live without harassment, to follow the law, and to exist without fear of arbitrary authority. The service dog, central to the conflict, now symbolized resilience, routine, and the legitimacy of individual rights within a community context. Community morale shifted as well. Neighbors who had once silently complied with Karen's arbitrary rules found renewed confidence in collective voice and vigilance. Meetings were attended, concerns voiced, and policies reviewed with scrutiny. The atmosphere of fear that had permeated social interactions was replaced with cautious optimism, a sense that governance was accountable and that personal rights would not be infringed upon without cause. Alex's experience served as an instructive example. Careful documentation, awareness of legal protections, and persistence could create meaningful change. For Karen, the consequences were enduring. The humiliation of public scrutiny and legal defeat reshaped her identity within the neighborhood. Her authority was challenged in every social interaction, and her previous influence evaporated. Houses that had once seemed aligned with her enforcement began to resist her judgment, rejecting the culture of fear she had propagated. Eventually, she chose to relocate, leaving behind the home that had been both her stronghold and the stage for the months of conflict. Her departure served as a symbolic closure to her tenure of control and marked the beginning of a new chapter for the community. Alex, meanwhile, embraced normalcy without fanfare. Work, errands, and daily routines continued uninterrupted, with Riley accompanying him on every step. The service dog's role, previously a point of contention, became a natural part of the neighborhood scenery, accepted and respected by residents. Alex's perseverance had ensured not only the protection of his rights, but also the reinforcement of legal standards that would safeguard future residents. The balance of authority and community trust had been restored. Months later, the neighborhood had transformed from a place of tension and surveillance to one of measured accountability and neighborly cooperation. Residents spoke openly about the lessons learned from the conflict, emphasizing fairness, empathy, and respect for legal protections. The HOA, rebuilt under new leadership, functioned with transparency and consistency, avoiding the arbitrary enforcement that had caused months of fear and uncertainty. The ripple effects of Alex's stand continued to resonate, a reminder that vigilance, patience, and the rule of law could triumph over unchecked authority. As Alex sat on his porch one evening, Riley resting at his feet, he reflected on the journey, the initial confrontations, the escalating harassment. The courtroom battles all had tested patience, resilience, and resolve. Yet, through each stage, principles had guided decisions. Adherence to law, meticulous documentation, and the refusal to yield to intimidation. The neighborhood had been transformed, the HOA reformed, and the rights of service animals reaffirmed. What had started as a personal struggle ended as a collective triumph, benefiting both the immediate residents and those who would follow in their footsteps. In the quiet of the evening, the subtle shift in the neighborhood's atmosphere was tangible. Lawful authority was respected, arbitrary power questioned, and community bonds strengthened. Alex and Riley walked the familiar streets, observing neighbors enjoying freedom from undue interference. The story of conflict, persistence, and justice had reached its natural conclusion, leaving behind lessons in resilience, legality, and the enduring importance of standing up for what is right. By the conclusion of Chapter 6, the narrative had resolved all major conflicts. Alex's victory against harassment, selective enforcement, and arbitrary authority had been cemented, Karen's influence had ended, and the neighborhood had embraced principles of fairness and accountability. The story closed on a note of restored peace, legal vindication, and a re-established sense of community, leaving readers with both satisfaction and reflection on the consequences of unchecked power.